The waitress with the strange accent served champagne while patrons laughed at her words, except the vampire king wasn't laughing. He stood, and silence rippled outward. Everyone thought she was just a clumsy foreigner, but he recognized the death tongue his enemies had tried to erase, and protecting her meant declaring war on the very people funding tonight's party. The silence rippled outward from where Lucian Draven stood, his presence commanding the Meridian Gala into a frozen tableau of wealth and power suddenly arrested by something ancient and dangerous. His eyes never left Clara Voss, whose hands trembled as she clutched the champagne tray, her fingers white-knuckled against the silver surface. She could feel every gaze in the room drilling into her back, could hear the whispered laughter dying into uncertain quiet as this tall man in the immaculate black suit moved through the crowd with a predator's economy of motion. Clara's mind scattered backward against her will, fragmentary images flickering like candle flame in darkness, her grandmother's weathered hands guiding hers across strange letters in a forbidden notebook, the old woman's voice low and urgent as she taught the words that must never be spoken outside their small cottage, the acrid smell of smoke and the screams when the village burned, and Clara ran with nothing but her grandmother's final warning ringing in her ears. She forced herself back to the present, to the glittering ballroom where crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across faces that now wore expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed contempt. Marcus Thorne stepped forward from his position near the orchestra platform, his perfectly tailored suit catching the light as he smiled with practiced charm that didn't quite reach his pale eyes. "Someone teach the help proper English," he said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to being entertained by others' misfortune. His wife, dripping in diamonds that probably cost more than Clara would earn in 5 years, laughed with a sound like breaking glass, and the sycophants surrounding them joined in with the eager desperation of those seeking approval from power. Clara felt heat flood her face, shame and anger warring in her chest as she tried to form an apology in words that wouldn't betray her again. But Lucian Draven had stopped 3 paces away, and she could feel the temperature drop, as though winter itself had walked into the room. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression of fury so controlled it was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. The death tongue, Morvathian. 3 centuries since it had been spoken aloud in public spaces. 3 centuries since the purge courts had systematically destroyed every speaker they could find, burning libraries and executing scholars in their zealous mission to erase what they feared. Lucian had watched it happen, had stood by while the language of his childhood, of his people's history and magic and identity, was consigned to ash and silence. At his shoulder, Sienna materialized with the silent efficiency of someone who had served him for decades. "My lord," she whispered, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "The Accords. If you intervene publicly, then complications with the Council, challenges to your authority, political ramifications that could destabilize everything you have built." He cut her off with a single word. "I heard what I heard." The finality in his tone made Sienna step back, though her expression remained carefully neutral. Lucian moved forward, closing the distance to Clara in 3 smooth strides that made her instinctively retreat until her back pressed against the buffet table. "What is your name?" he asked, and his voice was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the coiled tension in his frame. Clara opened her mouth to answer in English, to give the safe response that would end this terrible attention, but her tongue betrayed her, and the old words spilled out before she could stop them. "Kethvara," she said, and the syllables rang clear and true in the sudden hush. "I am no one." The phrase her grandmother had taught her as the proper response to inquiry from strangers, the words that marked speaker as supplicant, carried across the ballroom like a bell tolling in an empty cathedral. Marcus Thorne went rigid, his body locked into absolute stillness for 3 heartbeats, and when his eyes snapped to focus on Clara, they flashed silver, reflective and inhuman in the chandelier light, before he regained control and the color bled back to ordinary blue. He recognized the tongue. Of course he did. His family had spent generations hunting its speakers to extinction, and that kind of obsession left marks deeper than memory. The crystal chandeliers above began to hum, a frequency just at the edge of hearing that made the champagne in Clara's flutes vibrate in sympathy. Security cameras mounted discreetly in the corners swiveled on their brackets, tracking toward the confrontation as though guided by invisible hands. Clara's pulse hammered visibly in the hollow of her throat, her breath coming shallow and quick as Lucian positioned himself between her and Thorn with deliberate intent. "This woman spoke the covenant tongue," Lucian said, and now his voice carried to every corner of the room, formal and inflectionless in the way of legal proclamations. Under Provision 17 of the Nocturnal Accords, any insult to a covenant speaker in the presence of a signatory lord constitutes grounds for redress under blood law. The silence shattered as dozens of conversations erupted simultaneously, guests turning to one another with expressions ranging from bafflement to dawning alarm as they tried to parse what was happening. "A blood challenge," Marcus interrupted, and his smile was a razor's edge. "I'm aware." He gestured lazily at Clara without looking at her directly. "I didn't realize we were honoring ancient treaties tonight, Draven. I thought this was a charity gala, not a theatrical production." Clara noticed then what her conscious mind had been trying to deny. Marcus's reflection in the wine glass on the nearby table was there but wrong, wavering and translucent as though he stood behind gauze. Not quite solid, not quite real. Her grandmother's stories about the night things, about creatures who cast shadows differently than living humans, rose unbidden in her memory, and she felt ice crystallize in her stomach. Sienna stepped forward, addressing the confused patrons with the patient tone of a professor lecturing slow students. The Nocturnal Accords were ratified in 1847 as a treaty between human governments and supernatural entities, seeking legal recognition and protection. Among the provisions was specific language protecting endangered supernatural languages and their speakers from persecution or mockery. The challenge protocol requires Lord Draven to either demand formal apology plus weregild, monetary compensation for the insult, or accept dual terms within 3 nights, the traditional response to treaty violation. Clara backed away from both men, her mind reeling. "I don't understand what's happening," she said, and her voice came out small and frightened. Lucien caught her wrist, his grip gentle but immovable, his skin cool against hers. "You will," he said quietly. "But first, tell me who taught you those words. Where did you learn to speak the old tongue with such fluency, such perfect accent that marks you as one raised in it, rather than one who studied from books?" Before Clara could answer, Marcus tossed his champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor in an explosion of crystal shards and golden liquid, the sound shocking in its violence. "The girl's a fraud," he declared, projecting his voice to the watching crowd. "Probably learned a few phrases from a book, some historical curiosity she stumbled across. This doesn't invoke the accords because there's no genuine speaker here, just a charlatan trying to make herself interesting." Lucian released Clara's wrist and turned to face Marcus fully, and when he spoke the air itself seemed to vibrate with power. The words that came from his mouth were Morvathian, an older dialect than Clara had ever heard, syllables that rang like bells and tasted of iron and starlight. She didn't understand all of it, but caught fragments. Ancient lineage, sacred duty, challenge accepted. 3 other guests scattered throughout the ballroom, people Clara had served drinks to without a second glance, suddenly straightened and turned toward Lucienne in perfect synchronization, their heads bowed in instinctive deference. Vampires recognizing their elder and superior through the invocation of their nearly extinct mother tongue. Marcus's carefully maintained facade cracked. His security team, 4 men in dark suits who had been positioned strategically around the perimeter, began moving forward through the crowd. Clara realized with mounting horror that both men were willing to fight over her, here and now, in the middle of a charity gala surrounded by humans who had no idea they were standing in a powder keg. Lucian made some gesture Clara didn't catch, too quick to follow, and suddenly, Sienna had her arm and was guiding her toward a side exit with firm insistence. The scene cut sharply as they moved from the golden warmth of the ballroom into the cold blue fluorescent lighting of the parking garage, the temperature differential making Clara gasp. Concrete and exhaust fumes replaced champagne and perfume, harsh reality after glittering illusion. "My car," Lucian said from behind them, and his tone brooked no argument. "Now!" Clara planted her feet, yanking her arm free from Sienna's grip. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, fear transmuting into anger. "I don't even know what you are, what any of this is. You can't just kidnap me because I speak a language that apparently means something in your world of insanity." She stopped, replayed in her mind the way Lucien had moved through the crowd, too fast, the spaces between his steps not quite matching the distance he covered. The way he stood absolutely motionless when listening, no fidgeting or breathing or tiny unconscious movements that marked living humans. Too fast, too still between motions. A black town car pulled up with Gregor at the wheel, an older man whose expression suggested he had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. He opened the rear door without comment. Lucien met Clara's eyes and said quietly, in English, "I am what your grandmother warned you about. The monsters in her bedtime stories. The reason she taught you to hide your gift. But I'm not what's hunting you tonight." The distinction mattered. Clara's hand hovered over the door handle, her entire body tensed for flight, and then she glanced back toward the garage entrance. Marcus Thorne emerged flanked by two men in black suits, his gaze sweeping the concrete expanse with predatory focus. Her decision crystallized. She got in the car. Sienna slid in beside her while Lucian took the front passenger seat, and Gregor pulled out into traffic with the smooth acceleration of long practice. The leather interior smelled of old money and older magic, something that made Clara's skin prickle with awareness. Morvathian was the ruling language of the night courts before the purge, Sienna explained as they merged onto the highway. Her voice was measured, factual, the tone of someone delivering bad news with professional detachment. 15 families tried to wipe it out 3 centuries ago, burning every text they could find and executing anyone who spoke it. 14 succeeded in their territories. Marcus Thorne's great-grandfather led the massacre in the eastern provinces, personally oversaw the death of thousands. He's continued the family tradition, hunting down any rumors of surviving speakers with the dedication of a man who believes he's protecting the world from danger. Clara felt her reality fracturing. "So speaking my grandmother's bedtime stories just started a war," she said, and hysteria crept into her voice despite her efforts to control it. "No," Lucien said without turning around. "The war never ended. You just revealed which side you're on, whether you knew there were sides or not." Sienna's phone chimed. She glanced at the screen and her expression went carefully blank. "Unknown number." She showed it to Lucien. The message read, "The girl's bloodline is confirmed. Withdraw your claim or the accords burn. We will not allow the old tongue to rise again. This is your only warning." Clara watched the city lights stream past the tinted windows, her mind trying to process everything and failing. "What happens in 3 nights?" she asked, because that seemed like the most immediate question in a situation full of terrible questions. Lucien met her eyes in the rearview mirror, and his gaze held the weight of centuries. "Either Marcus apologizes and pays blood price for the insult to you and to the language itself," he said, "or we meet at the sanctum and one of us doesn't leave." The finality in those words settled over the car like snow, cold and inevitable, and Clara understood that her life as a waitress trying to scrape by in a city that barely noticed her existence had ended the moment she spoke her grandmother's words aloud. The wrought iron gates swung open with a whisper of old hinges as Gregor guided the town car up the winding drive toward Lucien's private estate. Clara pressed her face to the window and watched invisible wards shimmer in the air like heat waves, protective magic thrumming with a frequency that made her teeth ache. The mansion rose from manicured grounds, all Gothic stone and severe angles, windows dark except for a few scattered lights that suggested occupancy without warmth. They entered through a side door that led directly into a private study, and Clara found herself surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books whose leather bindings cracked with age. The air smelled of old paper and something else, something metallic and sharp that she couldn't quite identify. Sienna gestured toward a high-backed chair positioned across from an imposing desk. "Sit," she said, not unkindly. "I'll bring water." When the glass arrived, Clara accepted it, but didn't drink, setting it carefully on the side table within reach. She'd read enough fairy tales to know better than to consume anything offered in a monster's house, even water that looked clear and harmless. Lucien noticed, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been approval. "Smart girl," he said as he settled into the chair opposite hers. "Your grandmother taught you well." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but somehow couldn't. "I need to know everything, Clara. Who was your grandmother? Where did she come from? How did she learn Morvathian well enough to teach you as a native speaker?" Clara's throat felt dry despite the untouched water. Her grandmother was Ilsa Cadros, she began, and the name felt strange in her mouth after so many years of trying to forget. "She was a refugee, came to our village when I was very small. Never explained from what, never talked about her past except in pieces, fragments that didn't connect into a coherent story. She taught me the language in secret, always by candlelight after dark, always with warnings to never speak it where others could hear. She said it was to keep the ancestors alive, to honor the dead by preserving their words. When I was 12, hunters came. They burned the village, killed anyone who tried to stop them." Clara's voice caught. "I thought they were human extremists, religious fanatics targeting refugees. Grandmother died in the fire. I ran." Lucian rose and moved to one of the bookshelves, running his fingers along spines until he found what he sought. He pulled down a leather ledger so old the binding had worn smooth, carried it back to the desk, and opened it with reverent care. The pages inside were yellowed parchment covered in meticulous handwriting, names and dates, and notations in several languages. He turned to a specific entry and rotated the book so Clara could read. There, in faded ink dated 1847, she saw her grandmother's name. Ilsa Cadros, witness to the purge, sworn to silence under pain of extinction. Granted mercy conditional upon complete surrender of the death tongue and cessation of all instruction in same, signed and sealed by the Council of Signatories. Clara's hands began to shake. "She broke her vow," she whispered. "For me. She violated the treaty that kept her alive because she couldn't bear to let the language die completely. She chose me over her own safety." Lucian closed the ledger gently. "The Accords granted mercy to purge survivors who surrendered the language," he explained. "It was the compromise that ended the bloodiest phase of the genocide. Live, but let your culture die with you. Most accepted, because the alternative was execution. But if Thorne's family learns that Ilsa had a living heir who speaks fluent Morvathian, who carries the language forward into a new generation, then the implications become dangerous. They'll claim my existence violates the treaty," Clara finished, the logic clicking into place with horrible clarity, "and kill me to close the loophole, to prevent any argument that the Accords were improperly enforced. I'm not just a person to them. I'm evidence of a treaty violation that could undermine everything they built." Sienna entered without knocking, her phone in hand and her expression grim. "We have a problem," she announced. "The Council of Signatories convenes tomorrow night for emergency session. Thorne filed a counterclaim an hour ago. He's arguing that you violated the Accords by allowing a forbidden speaker to exist in your territory, that your failure to report and neutralize the violation makes you complicit in treaty breaking. He's demanding your censure and Clara's immediate surrender to council custody pending investigation. The irony struck Clara like a physical blow. The law meant to protect her had become the mechanism to trap Lucian, to punish him for defending her. The window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Clara's scream caught in her throat as a crossbow bolt buried itself in the wall an inch from her head, the iron tip still vibrating from impact. Lucian moved faster than thought, a blur of motion that positioned his body between Clara and the broken window before her mind could process what was happening. Gregor and 2 guards she hadn't known were present rushed toward the perimeter, weapons appearing in their hands with practiced efficiency. The smell hit her next, acrid and herbal, burned sage mixing with something darker. Hunter wards, designed to weaken supernatural defenses and mark targets. Glass crunched under boots. Clara's heartbeat thundered in her ears like a drum. Lucian pulled the bolt free from the wall with one smooth motion, examined it, sniffed the tip. "Wolfsbane and consecrated silver," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Thorn's not waiting 3 nights. He's starting the war now." Gregor's voice crackled over a comm system Clara couldn't see. "3 shooters, my lord, East Woods, moving fast." Sienna drew a blade from inside her coat, old steel etched with runes that seemed to drink the light. Her transformation from efficient assistant to deadly warrior took seconds. Lucian turned to Clara. "Basement," he ordered. "Now." Something in Clara snapped. She'd spent her entire life running, hiding, letting others die while she survived. Her grandmother had broken a sacred vow to give her the gift of language, had burned to keep Clara safe, and she was done repaying that sacrifice with cowardice. She grabbed the iron fire poker from beside the hearth, hefted its weight, felt the cold metal settle into her grip like it belonged there. "I'm not hiding while people die for me," she said. And her voice came out steady, despite the terror thrumming through her veins. Lucien paused, looked at her, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. Almost smiled, though the situation hardly warranted humor. "Your grandmother taught you more than words," he said. "Then stay behind me and don't do anything stupid." The guards returned dragging a figure in black tactical gear between them. One shooter captured, the others escaped into the woods. The captured hunter thrashed and fought despite being outmatched, snarling curses in English until one of the guards forced him to his knees. Lucien approached, crouched to eye level. "Who sent you?" the hunter spat in his face. Then, in broken Morvathian, accent atrocious but meaning clear, he hissed, "Kethsal Mor. The bloodline ends." The interrogation lasted less than a minute before the hunter bit down hard on something hidden in his back teeth. The cyanide worked fast, foam and convulsions and then stillness, dead in seconds, taking his information with him. Clara caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror as they moved the body. Still gripping the fire poker, knuckles white, face pale but determined. She looked like her grandmother. The same sharp cheekbones, the same set to her jaw, the same refusal to break that had let Ilsa walk into fire rather than betray what she believed. The realization settled over Clara like a weight. She'd been running from this her whole life, from the legacy and responsibility and danger that came with being Ilsa Kadros's heir, but running hadn't kept her safe. It had only delayed the inevitable. Lucian supervised the burning of the hunter's body in the estate's furnace, protocol for dealing with those who died in supernatural conflicts. When he emerged, ash-smudged and weary, he found Clara still in the study. "The council meets in 16 hours, he told her. "If I can't prove your right to exist under the Accords, Thorn wins by default. The law favors those who act first, and he's positioned himself as the defender of treaty sanctity. We need evidence, documentation, something that establishes you were protected before tonight." The search began in Lucian's private archive, a vault beneath the estate accessible only through a hidden door in the study floor. Stone steps led down into climate-controlled darkness illuminated by motion sensor lights that clicked on as they descended. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and shelves holding scrolls, bound documents, blood-sealed contracts in a dozen languages, the accumulated legal history of 3 centuries. Clara read entries by candlelight, her eyes straining over cramped handwriting and archaic phrasing. Lucian cross-referenced dates in massive ledgers, tracking bloodlines and treaty signatures. Sienna catalogued witness statements, building timelines that might reveal gaps or inconsistencies they could exploit. The hours blurred together. Coffee arrived and went cold. The clock ticked steadily toward dawn, each minute bringing them closer to the council meeting and further from hope. Then Clara found it, tucked into a folder marked Miscellaneous Domestic Records, a marriage certificate dated 1979, ornate calligraphy on heavy paper. Ilsa Kadros, wed to Thomas Voss, in a ceremony witnessed by family and friends. Clara stared at the name she'd never heard. Thomas Voss. Her grandfather, a man her grandmother had never mentioned, whose existence had been erased so thoroughly, Clara hadn't known to ask. Lucian examined the certificate with growing excitement. Thomas Voss was a minor vampire, he explained. Low nobility, not particularly powerful or politically connected, but nobility nonetheless under the Accords. If he married a Covenant speaker, that marriage would have granted Ilsa and any descendants permanent protection under spousal privilege clauses. This is it. This proves your right to exist. Clara's hope flared and died in the same breath. The certificate is unsigned by a council witness, she said, pointing to the blank line at the bottom where official validation should appear. Invalid without that signature. It's just a piece of paper. Lucian swept a stack of documents off the desk in a rare display of emotion, papers scattering across the stone floor. Thorne's family made sure every loophole was sewn shut, he said, and frustration made his voice rough. They killed Thomas Voss and buried the marriage so thoroughly, even the official records show nothing. Without council validation, this certificate means nothing legally. Clara watched him, saw the weight of centuries pressing down on shoulders that had carried too much loss already. What if I just leave? She asked quietly. Disappear. You tell the council I died in the attack tonight, that the hunters succeeded. You're released from any obligation to protect me. Thorne gets his victory, and I vanish into some remote place where no one will ever hear me speak Morvathian again. Lucian stopped, turned, looked at her with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. I've spent 3 centuries watching my people's culture be erased, he said, piece by piece, word by word, until almost nothing remains. You are the last living native speaker of Morvathian, Clara. The last person on this earth who learned the language as a child, who speaks it the way my wife spoke it, the way my children would have spoken it if they'd lived. I don't care what the Accords say. I won't let you become a footnote in someone's history of successful cultural genocide. The emotional shift was palpable. Clara saw past the vampire king, past the powerful lord with his estate and his resources, to the man who'd lost everything twice over and refused to lose it a third time. Sienna's voice broke the moment. I found something, she said, holding up a slim volume bound in red leather. A reference to a witnessing right, an emergency provision in the original Accords. If a council member publicly affirms a bond or protection before the full assembly, it retroactively validates that protection even without prior documentation. It's meant for situations where records were destroyed or lost, where oral testimony is all that remains. But there's a cost. The witness stakes their own standing on the truth of their claim. If the claim is proven false, they're exiled from the council. If it's challenged and they lose the challenge, they're executed. Lucian's decision took no time at all. I'll invoke the right, he said. I'll testify that Thomas Voss told me of his marriage before he died, that he asked me to protect his wife and child if anything happened to him. It's not technically a lie. He did speak to me before the end, though he never mentioned the specifics. I can make it work. Sienna set the book down carefully. My lord, she said, and her voice carried warning. You'd be betting your life that we can prove a marriage from 46 years ago that someone clearly tried to bury. We have a certificate without validation, a dead vampire whose records have been scrubbed, and a refugee who broke her vow to teach forbidden language to her grandchild. If Thorn challenges your testimony and we can't substantiate it, you die. What if Thomas Voss never existed? What if this is all fabrication? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Clara realized that everything, all of it, her survival and Lucian's honor and the future of an entire language, rested on proving the existence of a man who'd been erased so thoroughly he might as well have been a ghost. The sanctum rose against the night sky like a monument to forgotten faith, a repurposed cathedral whose stained glass windows had been replaced with blackout panels that kept the interior shrouded in perpetual darkness. Clara followed Lucienne through the massive doors, into a space that smelled of candle wax and old stone, her footsteps echoing on marble floors worn smooth by centuries of passage. 13 chairs formed a circle in the center of the nave, each one occupied by a vampire whose age and power pressed against her awareness like physical weight. No electric light illuminated the chamber. Only candles positioned at intervals that cast shadows moving in ways shadows shouldn't move, writhing and stretching independent of the flames that birthed them. Marcus Thorne sat in the western position, his posture relaxed and confident, while Lucien took his place directly across at the eastern point. 10 neutral lords filled the spaces between them, their faces ranging from curious to hostile to carefully blank. Clara stood in the center circle, positioned where the accused always stood, and tried not to think about how many people had stood in this exact spot before being condemned to death. The eldest of the council presided from the northern chair. A woman so ancient, her skin had gone paper-thin and translucent, stretched over bones that seemed too delicate to support even her slight weight. Lady Cassia's eyes were like black water, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing, seeing everything. "We convene under the nocturnal accords to settle a matter of covenant law," she announced, her voice surprisingly strong for someone who looked like a strong wind might scatter her to dust. "Lord Draven has invoked protection for this woman under spousal privilege clauses. Lord Thorne has filed counterclaim alleging treaty violation. We will hear both arguments and render judgment according to established precedent." Marcus Thorne rose with fluid grace, playing to the assembled lords with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I bear no ill will toward the girl," he began, and his tone was reasonable, almost sympathetic. "She is an innocent caught in circumstances beyond her understanding. But the accords are clear and unambiguous. Moravathian was surrendered by mutual agreement in 1847. Its survival, its continuation into new generations, violates our treaty with the human authorities who granted us legal existence and the rights we now enjoy." He paced as he spoke, making eye contact with each neutral lord in turn. "In 1847, we stood on the brink of extinction. Human governments had discovered our existence and were preparing systematic purges that would have ended our kind forever. The accords were our salvation, a negotiated peace in which we agreed to suppress dangerous supernatural practices in exchange for legal personhood and property rights. Morvathian was classified as dangerous because it could compel supernatural obedience when spoken by trained mages, could bind and control those of our kind through nothing more than words properly pronounced. We surrendered it not out of shame, but out of necessity, to prove we could be trusted to police ourselves." Thorne stopped in front of Clara, studied her with what might have been genuine regret. "If we allow this, if we permit the forbidden tongue to survive and flourish, we invite human governments to revoke the accords entirely. Everything we've built over nearly 2 centuries, our businesses and legitimacy and safety, all of it rests on the foundation of promises kept. Break one promise, and the entire structure collapses." The girl must be silenced, not out of cruelty, but out of survival imperative. "It is regrettable, but necessary." Several of the neutral lords nodded, swayed by logic that sounded unassailable when delivered with such conviction. Clara felt her chances of survival shrinking with each nod, each murmur of agreement. Lucien stood, and the candles flickered, as though responding to his presence. "I invoke the witnessing right," he declared. "Clara Voss is the granddaughter of Ilse Kadros, who was wed to Thomas Voss in 1979. Thomas Voss was vampire nobility, turned and sired by a member of this very council. His marriage to a covenant speaker granted spousal privilege that extends to descendants. Clara's existence is not a treaty violation, but a protected legacy, sanctioned by the laws Lord Thorn claims to defend." Lady Cassia leaned forward, her black eyes fixed on Lucien. "Do you have proof of this marriage? Witnessed proof validated by council authority?" Lucien produced the certificate from inside his coat, the paper crackling slightly as he unfolded it. Cassia took it with hands that trembled minutely, examined the calligraphy and seals with the attention of someone who had seen thousands of such documents over her long existence. "Unsigned," she said flatly. "Without council witness validation, this is merely a private document with no legal standing under the Accords." Thorne's smile was triumphant, barely restrained. Clara felt something break loose inside her, some final restraint that had been holding back the words. She spoke in Morvathian, formal and ritualistic, each syllable precisely articulated the way her grandmother had taught her. "Kethmara vel Ilse Kadros, Marvel Thomas Voss, Survin Anno 1979. I am the daughter of Ilse Kadros, wed to Thomas Voss, born in the year 1979. The air itself vibrated with the resonance of the ancient tongue, power rippling outward in waves that made 3 of the candles extinguish simultaneously. Every vampire in the circle went rigid, their supernatural senses responding to something fundamental in the language that predated their individual existence. Lady Cassia stood slowly, her expression transformed from judicial neutrality to something approaching awe. "The tongue commands truth," she said. "It is one of the reasons Morvathian was feared and forbidden. Lies cannot be spoken in high formal Morvathian, not by native speakers who learned it in childhood. The language itself rejects falsehood. The girl believes what she says. She believes it with absolute conviction." The power dynamic in the room shifted perceptibly. 2 of the neutral lords who had been nodding along with Thorne's arguments now leaned slightly toward Lucien's side of the circle, reconsidering their positions. Belief wasn't proof in any legal sense, but it created doubt, and doubt was enough to prevent immediate condemnation. Thorne recovered quickly, pivoting to a new attack vector. "Then where is Thomas Voss?" he asked, spreading his hands in a gesture of confused inquiry. If he was nobility, if he held rank sufficient to grant spousal privilege, there would be records, birth documentation, siring certificates, property holdings. Yet I find nothing in the archives about any Thomas Voss. Unless the marriage itself was fabrication, a desperate invention by a refugee trying to protect herself. He let the implication hang in the air, poisonous and effective. The doors at the rear of the sanctum opened with a boom that echoed through the vaulted space. Sienna entered, moving quickly despite carrying a small wooden box with obvious care. She was breathless, her normally perfect composure disrupted by whatever urgency had driven her. "We found him," she announced. The box landed on the floor in the center of the circle with a solid thunk. Sienna opened it and removed 3 items. A signet ring bearing an unfamiliar crest, a lock of dark hair tied with faded ribbon, and a single photograph creased and yellowed with age. The photograph showed Clara's grandmother as a young woman, face unlined and eyes bright, standing beside a man in clothing that screamed 1970s fashion. On the back, in careful handwriting, someone had written, "Our first spring, TV." Clara took the photograph with shaking hands, studied the image of her grandmother smiling in a way she'd never seen in life. The man beside her had his arm around her waist, protective and proud, but something about him seemed off. She tilted the photo to catch the candlelight better and saw it. The man's shadow fell at the wrong angle, too sharp and too dark for the diffuse sunlight visible in the background. "He's already turned here," Clara said, realization striking like lightning. "This was taken after he became a vampire. Look at his shadow, how it doesn't match the light source. He's not fully physical anymore." Lucian drew in a sharp breath. If he was turned before the marriage, then the union required a blood ratification, a ritual binding witnessed and sanctioned by supernatural authority. It would have been witnessed by his sire, the vampire who turned him and held responsibility for his actions. He looked around the circle of assembled lords. Who was Thomas Voss's sire? Which of you turned him and oversaw his marriage? The silence stretched for 5 heartbeats, 10, and Clara thought maybe no one would answer, that this final piece of proof would remain forever out of reach. Then Lady Cassia smiled, slow and satisfied, like someone who had been waiting decades for exactly this moment. "I was," she said, and the words fell into the chamber like stones into still water. The room froze. Every vampire present turned to stare at Cassia, and Thorn went pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. Cassia continued in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. "I turned Thomas Voss in 1977. He was a scholar, a historian who had dedicated his human life to studying our kind. When he discovered our existence was real rather than mythological, he begged me for the gift of immortality so he could continue his research properly. I granted his request. 2 years later, he brought me a human woman who spoke the old tongue, who carried Moravathian in her voice, like music I thought I would never hear again. He begged me to witness their binding, to sanctify a marriage between vampire nobility and covenant speaker. I did. I sealed it with my own blood according to the old rites." Cassia pricked her finger with one long nail, let a single drop of blood fall onto the unsigned marriage certificate still resting on the floor. Where the blood landed, invisible ink appeared, spreading across the bottom of the document in elegant script that had been hidden for 46 years. Cassia's signature, her seal, her validation as witness and council authority, preserved by magic that required her blood to reveal it. Thorn's carefully constructed argument crumbled. He rallied with desperate speed. "This proves nothing about the child," he insisted. "Thomas Voss disappeared in 1982. He never claimed an heir, never registered a daughter with the council. For all we know, the marriage ended and the woman remarried, bore children to another father. There's no documented connection between Clara and Thomas Voss." "Because he was murdered," Clara said, and the words came out raw and jagged, scraping her throat on the way up. "My grandmother told me hunters killed him. She fled, went into hiding. Never told me he was vampire nobility because she thought they'd killed him for marrying her, for defying the families who wanted Moravathian erased completely. She was protecting me from a legacy she thought had died with him." "The 1982 purge sweeps," Lucian said quietly, pieces connecting with terrible clarity. "Thorn's grandfather led them, claimed he was rooting out treaty violators who refused to surrender forbidden practices. But it was never about the treaty. It was about eliminating anyone connected to Moravathian, about ensuring the language died completely." He turned to face Thorn directly. "You didn't just try to erase the language, you hunted everyone connected to it. Thomas Voss, Ilsa. And you've been hunting Clara since the moment you heard her speak at the gala. You leaked her existence to your people, sent hunters to kill her before she could reach council protection. This was never about preserving the accords. This was about finishing what your family started." Thorn's mask slipped, rage and something uglier flashing across his face before he regained control. "You can't prove any of that," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. "I don't need proof for what I witnessed," Cassia said, and her tone carried the finality of judgment rendered. "Thomas Voss came to me before he died. He knew the hunters were closing in, knew his time was limited. He told me that if anything happened to him, his child must be protected. He made me swear on the old oaths. I gave my word. The witnessing right is valid. Clara Voss has covenant protection under my direct authority as Thomas Voss's sire and the witness to his marriage. Any action against her is action against me. The power had flipped completely. Clara felt it in the sudden shift of attention, the way the neutral lords now looked at Thorne with suspicion rather than at her with condemnation. She was legally protected, her right to exist validated by the eldest member of the council. Thorne could not touch her without defying Cassia herself, and no one defied the Ancient Ones lightly. But Thorne hadn't survived this long by accepting defeat gracefully. He stood, straightened his suit, and delivered his final blow. Then I invoke the trial of necessity, he declared. If the accords themselves are at risk, individual protections can be overridden by majority council vote. The safety of our entire kind supersedes the rights of any single vampire or their protected family. He pulled out his phone, swiped to a news site, held it up so everyone could see the headline blazing across the screen. Breaking. Secret vampire language discovered. Government demands investigation. Supernatural community faces legal scrutiny. Lucian's face went absolutely still as understanding crashed over him. Thorne had leaked the story, had deliberately exposed Clara's existence to human media, forcing a crisis that made her continued survival a political liability rather than a legal question. "You're forcing the council to choose," Lucian said, and his voice was ice. "Protect Clara and risk human governments revoking the accords, or sacrifice her to maintain secrecy and stability. You've engineered a scenario where saving her threatens everyone." Thorne smiled without warmth. "I'm protecting our kind from the consequences of sentimentality. The accords are more important than one girl, more important than a dead language, more important than Lord Draven's guilt over failures that happened centuries ago. If the council has any wisdom left, they'll see that." Lady Cassia looked at Lucienne, and something ancient and sad moved in her black eyes. "The trial of necessity convenes in 2 nights," she said. "Prepare your arguments. Bring evidence that Clara Voss's continued existence does not threaten the accords or our relationship with human governments. This is no longer about lineage or marriage certificates or witness testimony. This is about whether our kind has any honor left, or whether we've become so focused on survival that we've forgotten what we're surviving for." The session ended without formal dismissal. Vampires rising and departing in small groups that clustered according to political allegiance. Clara stood in the center circle feeling like she'd won a battle only to discover the war had just escalated beyond anything she could comprehend. And somewhere in the human world, newsrooms were lighting up with a story that could destroy everything the vampires had built over nearly 2 centuries of careful peace. The morning news cycle exploded with a story that had everything conspiracy theorists dreamed of: secret societies, ancient languages, and grainy phone footage from a high society gala showing what appeared to be a supernatural confrontation. Clara sat in Lucian's study, watching herself on multiple screens as news anchors dissected the viral video with breathless excitement. The chyron running beneath her terrified face read, "Ancient language sparks occult community drama. Government officials promise investigation." The footage had been captured by some guest's phone, the angle awkward and shaky, but clear enough to show Lucian standing between Clara and Marcus Thorne, clear enough to catch the moment Clara spoke in Morvathian, and something in the air itself seemed to respond. Social media had done the rest, amplifying and distorting until the story grew legs and ran wild. Hashtags trended. Amateur linguists tried to identify the language. Fringe groups claimed it was proof of everything from ancient aliens to demonic possession. The truth, as always, was stranger than any fiction they could construct. Lucian's phone rang continuously, each call another piece of his carefully constructed empire crumbling. Clara watched him take the calls with increasing tension, watched his expression go carefully blank as business partners withdrew from deals, as investors demanded explanations he couldn't provide, as decades of relationship capital burned in the media firestorm. A senator whose name Clara recognized from news coverage announced a formal investigation into unregistered supernatural activities, his statement dripping with moral outrage that barely concealed the fact he was on Thorne's payroll and had been for years. This was no longer a private supernatural matter contained within the council's jurisdiction. Human authorities were circling, drawn by the scent of scandal and the opportunity to appear decisive in the face of public concern. Clara felt guilt settle over her like a physical weight, crushing and inescapable. "I'm destroying you," she said when Lucian finally set the phone down. "Everything you built over centuries, your businesses, your reputation, your standing with the council, just let me go. Disappear me somewhere remote and tell them I died. You can salvage this." Lucian looked at her with eyes that had seen empires fall and understood that some things mattered more than survival. "They want you to run," he said quietly. "It proves guilt, validates every fear Thorne has manufactured. The moment you disappear, you become the monster in the story, the dangerous creature that had to be eliminated for public safety. We don't run, we fight." Sienna entered carrying a glass of water, set it on the table beside Clara without comment. Clara picked it up and drank, the simple act carrying weight it wouldn't have days ago. Trust earned through fire and blood. The water was cool and clean and tasted like the first honest thing she'd experienced since the gala. Gregor appeared in the doorway, his normally composed expression troubled. "My lord, we have a problem. 3 council members have issued public statements calling for Miss Voss to be detained for questioning pending the trial of necessity. Lords Matheson, Chen, and Volkov. All 3 have received substantial donations to their various charitable foundations in the past 48 hours. The timing suggests coordination." Clara didn't need Sienna to explain that detained for questioning was code for imprisoned, probably in some council facility where accidents could happen and witnesses would be conveniently absent. Thorne was moving pieces on the board with ruthless efficiency, buying votes and manufacturing public pressure that would make Clara's elimination seem reasonable, even necessary. The trial of necessity convened in 48 hours. Lucian needed to sway 6 of the 13 council votes to protect Clara, and right now the math looked impossible. Even with Lady Cassia's support, they were outnumbered by lords who valued stability over honor, who would sacrifice one girl to preserve their comfortable existence. The strategy session lasted hours, Lucian and Sienna and Gregor mapping out arguments and counter-arguments, trying to find an angle that would prove Clara's existence didn't threaten the Accords, while simultaneously demonstrating that Thorne's media leak was the real danger. They needed something unexpected, something that would shift the narrative before Thorne could counter it. They needed a miracle. Lucian made a call, spoke briefly in tones too low for Clara to hear, then stood. "Get your coat," he told Clara. "There's someone you need to meet." Dr. Marin Holt worked out of a converted warehouse in the industrial district, surrounded by filing cabinets and computer servers and whiteboards covered in diagrams that mapped supernatural treaty law across 3 centuries. She was in her 50s, gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, wearing reading glasses that she peered over with undisguised skepticism when Lucien explained what he needed. "You want me to argue that a resurrected blood magic language is safe," she said flatly, "that the tongue capable of compelling supernatural obedience through properly constructed syntax is somehow harmless in the mouth of this girl. Have you lost your mind, Draven? I've seen what Morvathian can do in the wrong hands. It's not a cultural artifact, it's a weapon." Lucien remained patient. "We need expert testimony that Morvathian, as Clara speaks it, is a cultural artifact and not a weapon. That the dialect she learned from her grandmother lacks the dangerous components that made the language subject to suppression. That she's no more threatening than someone who speaks dead Latin or ancient Greek." Marin looked at Clara with the assessing gaze of a researcher encountering an unexpected specimen. "Let's test that theory." The research process was exhaustive and slightly humiliating. Marin recorded Clara speaking, ran linguistic analysis software that broke down phonemes and syntax patterns, compared the results against historical texts that documented Morvathian in its full ceremonial form. Clara recited everything she knew, the lullabies her grandmother had sung, the greetings and pleasantries, the prayers for the dead that had been whispered over her grandmother's unmarked grave. Hours passed in repetition and analysis until Clara's throat hurt and her head ached from concentration. Marin finally sat back, removed her glasses, and rubbed her eyes. "She doesn't have the syntax for compulsion spells," she announced. "The dialect she speaks is colloquial, domestic, stripped of the ceremonial constructions that gave Morvathian its dangerous properties. It's like the difference between Church Latin and the vulgar Latin spoken by common people. Same root language, completely different applications. She's speaking a safe dialect." Hope spiked through Clara's chest, sharp and painful. This could work. Expert testimony from a respected scholar with security clearance to work on supernatural matters could sway neutral council members, could provide cover for those looking for reasons to vote against Thorne's power play. Then Marin's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her face went white. The letter arrived via courier, expensive paper, and anonymous postage. Marin opened it with shaking hands and read aloud. "Withdraw your testimony, or your daughter pays." Inside was a photograph of an 8-year-old girl with Marin's eyes, playing in a schoolyard, clearly taken without her knowledge. The threat was unambiguous. Marin sat silent for a long moment, the photo trembling in her grip. Then she set it down carefully and looked at Lucienne. "I've spent my entire career documenting what powerful people tried to erase," she said. And her voice was steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "Treaties and languages and cultures that someone decided weren't worth preserving. I've watched knowledge disappear because people were too afraid to defend it. I won't let them erase you, Clara. I won't let them win by making me too terrified to tell the truth." Lucian assigned 2 of his guards to Marin's family immediately, sent them with instructions to maintain constant surveillance and eliminate any threat with extreme prejudice. The cost of protection was rising, measured in resources and personnel, and the favors he'd have to call in from allies who were increasingly reluctant to associate with him. Every choice carried weight, consequences rippling outward like stones dropped in still water. Sienna worked late into the night trying to crack encrypted files she'd found on Thorne's company server. The encryption was sophisticated, military-grade protection on what should have been routine corporate data. The timestamps matched the original purge dates from the 1980s, suggesting the files contained something Thorne desperately wanted hidden. She'd get in eventually, but eventually might be too late. Clara found Lucien in his study well past midnight, staring at a portrait she hadn't noticed before. The woman in the painting wore 18th-century dress, all elaborate fabric and careful posture, but her eyes held warmth and intelligence that transcended the formal composition. "Who was she?" Clara asked quietly. Lucien didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of grief that had never fully healed. "My wife, Elena. She spoke Morvathian, not the colloquial dialect like you, but the full ceremonial tongue. She was a scholar, a mage, someone who understood the language's power and used it to protect our people. Thorne's grandfather burned her alive in 1784, claimed she was using forbidden magic to threaten the nascent Accords. He made an example of her. I was away when it happened, returned to find nothing but ashes." The raw pain in his words made Clara's chest tighten. "I'm sorry," she said, inadequate but genuine. He turned away from the portrait. "This isn't about my grief. It's about preventing the same thing from happening to you, from letting them erase another piece of our culture, because fear is easier than understanding." The next morning, Clara walked the estate grounds with Lucienne for the first time since the Hunter attack, breathing night air that smelled like approaching rain and feeling grass beneath her feet instead of marble or carpet. The normality of it felt surreal given everything happening in the wider world. She asked the question that had been building since she saw the portrait. "Why didn't you tell me before?" About your wife. About why this matters so much to you personally. Because this isn't about my grief, he repeated. It's about your life, your right to exist without apologizing for what you are. If I made it about my loss, it diminishes your struggle, makes you a symbol instead of a person. Clara stopped walking, turned to face him. I thought learning the language would make my grandmother proud, she admitted. Thought it was honoring her memory. Instead, it got people killed. Hunters died attacking your estate. Marin's daughter is in danger. You're losing everything. Maybe Thorn is right. Maybe some things should stay buried. Language isn't a weapon, Lucian said firmly. What people do with it, how they choose to respond to it, that's where the danger lives. Thorn wants you silent because silence is control. If he can make you believe your existence is the problem, you'll eliminate yourself, and he wins without lifting a hand. Don't give him that power. Gregor's voice crackled through the earpiece Lucian wore constantly now. Sir, you need to see this. Immediately. The security room displayed footage from cameras positioned throughout the estate. Sienna had isolated a clip from 2 nights ago showing one of Lucien's guards meeting with a man in the garden shadows. Money changed hands. Documents were exchanged. The guard's face was clearly visible, a vampire named Henrik who'd been with Lucien's household for 30 years. Betrayal tasted like ashes. Lucien had Henrik detained within minutes, brought to a secure room where interrogation could proceed without interruption. The guard broke quickly, probably knowing that resistance would only prolong the inevitable. Thorn paid me to plant listening devices throughout the estate, Henrik confessed. In the study, the archive, even Miss Voss's bedroom. He knows your trial strategy, every argument you plan to make, every piece of evidence you've gathered. He's been 3 steps ahead the entire time because I gave him the map. Everything was compromised. Every conversation, every planning session, every moment they'd thought was private had been monitored and reported. Thorn would have counters prepared for every argument, would know exactly how to undermine Marin's testimony and exploit any weakness in their case. They had 1 night to build a new strategy that Thorn couldn't predict, 1 night to salvage any chance of surviving the trial of necessity. Clara surprised herself by being the one to break the desperate silence. What if we don't fight his narrative, she said slowly, working through the idea as she spoke. What if we use it? Everyone's talking about the language now, arguing about whether it's dangerous or beautiful. What if instead of hiding what I can do, we showcase it? Prove that Morvathian is a cultural treasure worth saving. Something beautiful that humanity would lose if we let fear destroy it. Make the public, human and vampire both, want to protect it. Lucien stared at her. That requires you to speak publicly. In front of the council, the media, everyone who wants you dead. You'd be making yourself a target in the most visible way possible. My grandmother hid for 50 years, Clara said, and her voice was steady. Lived in fear, never spoke her native tongue except in whispers, died without ever being fully herself. I'm done hiding. If I'm going to die anyway, let it be while fighting instead of cowering. Marin arrived at the estate within the hour, bringing historical texts and her linguistic analysis. She coached Clara on a specific passage, an ancient Morvathian poem about peace and understanding between different peoples. The language was formal without being ceremonial, beautiful without being dangerous. Clara would recite it at the trial, let the council and the watching world hear Morvathian as art rather than weapon. They rehearsed until Clara could deliver the passage flawlessly, until the words flowed like music and carried meaning in their sound as much as their translation. Sienna burst into the study at 3 a.m, laptop clutched against her chest and her face white as paper. My lord, she said breathlessly. I cracked Thorn's encrypted files. Her hands shook as she turned the screen toward Lucian. These are kill orders, dated 1982, signed by Marcus Thorn himself. He didn't just support the purge, he led it. Orchestrated the systematic murder of every known Morvathian speaker and their families. And according to this, the list of targets included 5 council members who opposed the language suppression. Thomas Voss wasn't the only council member he murdered. He killed them all and made it look like purge compliance. He's been eliminating opposition for 40 years. The implications crashed over them like a wave. Thorne hadn't just violated the accords. He'd committed treason against the council itself, had murdered fellow lords to advance his family's vendetta against a language he feared. If they could prove it, if they could present this evidence at the trial, it would destroy him completely. But it would also force the council to confront their own complicity, their willingness to overlook murder, as long as it maintained comfortable stability. The trial of necessity was no longer just about Clara's survival. It was about whether the council had any integrity left, or whether they'd become so corrupted by fear and self-interest that they'd protect a murderer to avoid uncomfortable truths. Clara looked at the kill orders on the screen, saw her grandfather's name among dozens of others, and felt something crystallize inside her. Tomorrow she would speak in front of the world, would make them hear the language her grandmother had died protecting, and she would not flinch. The sanctum was packed beyond any gathering Clara had witnessed, every council member present in their designated chairs, while gallery seats overflowed with 200 vampires whose combined age totaled millennia. Outside the cathedral's heavy doors, human media had set up equipment to live stream audio per Accord's rules. Their presence a reminder that this trial existed at the intersection of 2 worlds that had coexisted uneasily for nearly 2 centuries. The atmosphere crackled with tension that felt almost electrical, candles burning as they had for centuries, but now joined by camera feeds on mounted monitors. Old world ritual colliding with new world transparency. Clara stood again in the center circle, but this time she wasn't alone in her fear. She could feel the weight of attention from humans and vampires alike, could sense that whatever happened in the next hours would reshape the fragile peace both species had built. Marcus Thorne rose to deliver his opening statement, and his voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms and courtrooms, bending reality to his will. "The human world is on the brink of panic," he began, gesturing toward the monitors displaying news coverage that continued to obsess over the viral gala footage. "Social media has turned this into a circus. Government officials are demanding answers. If we harbor a speaker of forbidden magic, if we're seen protecting someone who represents everything the Accords were designed to suppress, governments will declare us threats. Registries will follow. Internment camps. War. We've seen this pattern before in human history, and we survived by proving we could be trusted to police ourselves. This girl, however innocent her intentions, represents an existential threat to that trust." 4 council members nodded along with his logic, their expressions grave. Thorne was persuasive because he was partially right. The media firestorm had created exactly the kind of panic that could unravel decades of careful diplomatic work. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Thorne wielded it like a master craftsman. Lucian stood when his turn came, and his approach was different. He didn't argue safety or attempt to downplay the media attention. Instead, he spoke directly to something deeper. "We signed the accords to protect ourselves, yes," he said quietly, "but also to preserve our culture under human scrutiny. To prove that supernatural beings could exist alongside humanity without surrendering everything that made us who we are. If we erase our own language, if we destroy the last living speaker of Morvathian because we're afraid of human reaction, we do their work for them. We become the monsters they fear, willing to murder the innocent to maintain comfortable lives." The council went silent. Several lords who had been nodding along with Thorne now looked uncertain, caught between pragmatic fear and uncomfortable conscience. Dr. Marin Holt was called to present her testimony, and she approached the center circle with academic precision. She displayed her linguistic analysis on the monitors, graphs, and phoneme breakdowns that demonstrated Clara's dialect lacked the syntactic structures necessary for compulsion magic. "Clara Voss speaks a colloquial form of Morvathian," Marin explained. her voice steady despite knowing her daughter's safety depended on being convincing. The dangerous ceremonial applications require specific grammatical constructions she simply doesn't possess. What she speaks is functionally inert as magic, a historical curiosity no different than someone speaking Church Latin or ancient Greek. It preserves cultural memory without presenting any supernatural threat. Thorne's cross-examination was sharp, but could she learn the dangerous forms? Could someone teach her the ceremonial constructions that would make her speech into compulsion magic? Marin didn't hesitate. Could anyone learn any language? Yes. We're talking about education and intent, not inherent danger. Should we ban all language education because someone might misuse knowledge? Should we suppress mathematics because it can be used to build weapons? The argument is absurd. The vote began to split visibly. 6 council members leaned toward protection, swayed by Marin's testimony and Lucian's appeal to honor. 6 leaned toward elimination, convinced by Thorne's pragmatic fear. Lady Cassia held the tie-breaking vote, her ancient face unreadable as she considered both arguments. Before she could speak, Sienna stepped forward from her position against the wall. "The council must hear new evidence," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmured deliberations. Thorne was on his feet immediately. "This is irregular. The testimony phase has concluded. You can't introduce new evidence without proper procedure and advance notice." Lady Cassia studied Sienna for a long moment. "Speak," she said simply. Sienna activated her laptop and the decrypted files appeared on every monitor in the chamber, text and scanned documents that had been buried for 4 decades. Kill orders dated between 1980 and 1985, each one meticulously detailed with names and locations and methods of execution. Thomas Voss's name appeared alongside 3 other council members who had disappeared during the Purge years, deaths that had been attributed to Purge violence but never properly investigated. "Marcus Thorne didn't just enforce the Purge," Sienna said, her voice ringing clear. "He used it to assassinate political rivals. 5 council members who opposed language suppression all died within a 5-year period, all deaths blamed on external Purge hunters, when in fact Thorne orchestrated the murders himself. He violated the accords he claims to protect. He committed treason against this council." The chamber erupted in chaos. Vampires in the gallery shouted questions and accusations, while council members turned to stare at Thorne with expressions ranging from shock to dawning horror. Thorne's carefully maintained composure cracked. "Those files are fabricated," he declared, pointing at the monitors. "Digital manipulation is trivial in this age. This is a desperate attempt by Draven to distract from the real issue." "They're signed with your family's blood seal," Sienna countered. "We had a mage verify the authenticity." "Blood magic doesn't lie, Lord Thorne. These are your orders in your hand, sealed with power that carries your unique signature." The room turned. Even Thorne's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly unwilling to meet his eyes. A blood seal couldn't be faked, couldn't be manipulated by any digital technology. If the mage verification was legitimate, then Thorne had just been exposed as a murderer who had spent 40 years hiding behind the very laws he'd violated. Thorne stood, desperation making him reckless. "This is a distraction," he shouted, pointing at Clara. "The girl is still a violation of the Accords regardless of my alleged past actions. You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment." Clara rose without being given permission to speak. She'd stayed silent through hours of debate, listening to people argue about her fate as though she were an object rather than a person. Now she stepped fully into the center circle and began to speak in Morvathian. The words of the poem Marin had taught her, flowing with the perfect accent her grandmother had drilled into her from childhood. The poem was about peace between different peoples, about honoring the dead by remembering rather than erasing them, about languages being bridges that connected past to present instead of weapons that divided. Her voice carried through the sanctum with unexpected resonance, each syllable seeming to hang in the air and harmonize with itself. The chamber itself responded, ancient stones humming with sympathetic vibration to a tongue they hadn't heard in centuries. One council member, a vampire so old his face had gone translucent with age, began to weep silently. Others closed their eyes, and Clara could see memory moving behind their eyelids, ghosts of times when Morvathian had been the common language of their kind rather than forbidden knowledge. When she finished, the silence felt sacred. No one moved or spoke until Lady Cassia broke the stillness. "I have not heard that poem in 200 years," she said softly. "My mother sang it to me when I was newly turned, when the world still made sense and our people had not yet learned to fear their own history." The emotional shift was palpable. The language wasn't a threat to be eliminated. It was a ghost they had all been running from, a piece of their collective past they'd tried to bury because remembering hurt too much. Clara had made them hear it not as magic or danger, but as art, as culture, as something beautiful they had lost. The vote wasn't even close. 9 council members voted to uphold Clara's protection under the witnessing right and Cassia's authority. 3 abstained, Thorne's remaining allies unwilling to support him but too politically compromised to vote against. Thorne stood alone, his power base crumbling as the evidence of his crimes settled over the chamber like ash. But he wasn't finished. "If the council won't act," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "then I will. By right of blood challenge, I demand satisfaction for the insult to my family's honor. Lucian Draven has harbored evidence of my alleged crimes, has used this forum to slander my name and destroy my reputation. I call him to the dueling circle." Lucien's realization came instantly. Thorne was forcing single combat, invoking ancient protocols that predated the Accords themselves. If Lucian refused the challenge, he would be exiled from the council and his territories forfeit. If he accepted, one of them would die. There was no middle ground, no compromise or negotiation. The Accords were rigid on this point. A blood challenge declared before the full council could not be withdrawn by either party. Lady Cassia's voice carried the weight of centuries. "The challenge is recognized under Article 5 of the Founding Accords. You will meet at moonrise tomorrow at neutral ground designated by this council. Single combat. First blood to incapacitation or death. No interference from allies or seconds. May your honor guide your blades." The session ended without further ceremony. Clara found herself back at Lucien's estate in a blur of motion and confusion, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. She wandered the halls until she found him in the armory, a room she hadn't known existed, surrounded by weapons that ranged from medieval swords to modern firearms. He was examining blades with the careful attention of someone whose life would depend on choosing correctly. "Can you beat him?" Clara asked from the doorway. Lucien looked up, considered lying, then decided she deserved honesty. "I don't know. He's younger. Turned during an era when combat training was more sophisticated. He's faster than me in pure speed, but I'm angrier, and anger can make up for a lot of disadvantages if you channel it properly." Clara stepped into the room, navigating between weapon racks. "Why are you doing this? You could have exiled me at any point, washed your hands of the whole situation and preserved everything you've built." Lucien set down the sword he'd been examining. "Because 300 years ago, I stood by while they burned my wife. I had the power to intervene, the authority to protect her, and I was too afraid of the political consequences. I was a coward when it mattered most. I'm not making that mistake twice." "This isn't about me," Clara said quietly. "This is about your guilt. You're trying to redeem yourself for something that happened centuries ago by dying for a stranger." Lucien paused, met her eyes. "Maybe," he admitted. "Does it matter? The motivations behind honor don't change whether the action itself is right." "It matters that you survive," Clara said, and she moved closer without quite meaning to. "It matters that you don't throw your life away on symbolic gestures." She reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the weapon table. The contact was electric, the first genuine connection between them that wasn't about protector and petitioner, but about two people who had both lost too much and were trying desperately not to lose more. Lucian's confession came quietly. If I fall tomorrow, Cassia will honor your protection. You'll be safe. The council vote established that. Whatever happens to me, you survive. I don't want to be safe at the cost of your life, Clara said, and the words came out more intense than she'd intended. I've had enough of people dying to protect me. First my grandmother, now you. When does it end? They were close now, too close, the space between them charged with everything unspoken. Then Sienna's knock interrupted the moment. My lord, Thorne's people are here for the neutral ground inspection, protocol for the duel. The preparation that followed felt surreal. Gregor checked protective wards and verified the dueling ground met accord specifications. Marin arrived to brief Clara on what to expect, the likely progression of vampire combat, and what interventions were permitted versus forbidden. Sienna sharpened blades with methodical precision, her face expressionless, but her hands moving with the controlled violence of someone preparing for war. Clara found the photograph of her grandparents tucked in her belongings, the image of Ilsa and Thomas smiling in their first spring together. She slipped it into her pocket, a talisman against the darkness, her own armor against whatever came next. Lucian found her on the terrace as moonrise approached, the sky already darkening toward the deep blue that preceded night. If I win, he asked quietly, what will you do? You can't go back to waiting tables. The old life is gone regardless of how this ends. Teach, Clara said without hesitation. Someone should learn Morvathian the right way, not as a weapon or something to fear, but as a gift, a connection to history and culture that deserves to survive. If the council allows it, if I survive this mess, that's what I want to do. Lucien smiled, rare and genuine, an expression that transformed his features from austere to almost warm. Then I'll win, he said simply. The conviction in his voice made it sound like a promise rather than hope. The sky turned fully dark, and the moon rose pale and full over the estate. Somewhere in the city, Thorne was preparing for the same confrontation. Tomorrow one of them would die, and the other would carry the weight of survival. Clara watched Lucien walk toward the waiting car that would take him to the dueling ground, and felt her heart clench with fear she couldn't name, for a man she barely knew, but who had become essential in ways she was only beginning to understand. The abandoned opera house rose from the industrial district like a monument to forgotten grandeur, its facade crumbling but still magnificent in the way only truly old buildings could be. The circular stage at its center had been cleared of debris, marked with a salt circle that glowed faintly in the candlelight positioned around the perimeter. Witnesses filled the balconies above, council members occupying the box seats, while human officials and media representatives clustered in the upper tiers, with cameras that would broadcast this confrontation to a watching world. The rules had been established with ceremonial precision: first to yield or first to die. No outside interference permitted under penalty of exile. Weapons restricted to blades only because firearms were considered dishonorable in formal combat. Marcus Thorne entered first, moving with the theatrical confidence of someone who had orchestrated this moment to maximum advantage. He wore black combat gear that looked expensive and professionally tailored, carried twin short swords that caught the light as he spun them in a showy display meant to intimidate. He played to the crowd, acknowledging supporters in the balconies with small gestures that suggested this was performance as much as combat. Lucien entered quietly, his focus absolute and undistracted by spectacle. He carried a single longsword, the blade dark with age and etched with symbols that predated the Accords by centuries. Clara recognized it from the portrait in his study as his wife's weapon, kept all these years as memorial and now drawn in her honor. Lady Cassia descended to the stage floor with the slow dignity of extreme age, positioned herself outside the salt circle, and drew a line connecting the circle's endpoints. "Begin when the bell tolls," she announced, and her voice carried to every corner of the opera house despite its softness. The bell rang, deep and resonant, and they began to circle. Thorn moved first, testing Lucian's defenses with quick feints that didn't commit to actual attacks. "You're fighting for a dead language and a dead love," he said, his tone conversational despite the deadly context. "Let go, Draven. Elena's been Ash for 2 centuries. The girl will forget her grandmother's words within a generation. This is pointless nostalgia." Lucian didn't respond, conserving his energy and watching Thorn's footwork for patterns. The first real clash came without warning. Thorn transitioning from feint to genuine attack so smoothly, Clara barely saw the shift. Steel met steel with a sound like breaking glass, sparks flying where the blades connected. Thorn was faster, his movements a blur that landed 3 strikes for every one of Lucien's counters. Lucien gave ground steadily, backing toward the circle's edge while blocking attacks that came from angles that should have been impossible. Blood bloomed first on Lucien's shoulder, where Thorn's blade found a gap in his defense, cutting through fabric and flesh in a single precise motion. Clara flinched in the gallery, gripping the railing hard enough her knuckles went white. The wound wasn't deep, but it was deliberate, Thorn demonstrating superior speed and skill with surgical clarity. But Lucien adapted. He stopped trying to match Thorn's speed and instead used experience, reading attacks 3 moves ahead and positioning himself where Thorn's momentum would carry him into vulnerable positions. When Thorn overextended on a particularly aggressive lunge, Lucien sidestepped and brought his sword down on Thorn's blade with enough force to send it skittering across the stage, metal ringing against wood as it spun out of reach. The fight became hand-to-hand immediately, both vampires moving with inhuman speed as they crashed through old set pieces left over from the opera house's functional days. Dust and splinters filled the air. Thorn got behind Lucien, locked an arm around his throat in a chokehold that would have killed a human in seconds. "Yield!" Thorn hissed directly into Lucien's ear. "You've lost. Save your life and accept exile." Lucien's vision began to narrow, black spots appearing at the edges as oxygen deprivation started shutting down even his supernatural physiology. He could yield, could save his life and lose everything else, could let Clara survive under Cassia's protection while he disappeared into some remote corner of the world where his failure couldn't haunt him. Clara's voice cut through the descending darkness. She cried out in Morvathian, the words ringing clear despite her fear. "Methkora, don't surrender." Lucien heard her. Something in the ancient tongue bypassed his conscious mind and went straight to whatever core of himself had survived 3 centuries of loss and compromise. Strength surged through muscles that had been failing, adrenaline and rage and the refusal to break combining into force that let him throw Thorn off with explosive violence. He dove for the fallen sword, fingers closing around the grip as Thorn rushed him from behind. The final exchange happened in the space between heartbeats. Thorn charged with the momentum of someone certain of victory. Lucien turned and sidestepped, letting Thorn's own speed carry him onto the blade. One clean strike through the chest, angled up to pierce the heart. Not silver, so it wouldn't be instantly fatal, but enough. Thorn fell, gasping, blood spreading across the stage floor in a pool that reflected candlelight like black mirror. "You haven't won," he managed, each word costing visible effort. "The humans will come for you, for all of us. They'll see this violence and remember why they feared our kind. Everything falls apart now." "Let them come," Lucien said quietly. "We'll face them with our honor intact, with our culture preserved. That's worth more than the comfortable lies you built your empire on." Thorn tried to respond but dissolved into ash before the words could form. Vampire biology, reclaiming him, per the traditions that governed their kind. The ash scattered across the stage in patterns that looked almost deliberate, then faded to nothing. The council witnesses stood in silent acknowledgement. Lucian had won by right of combat, his position vindicated and Thorn's crimes confirmed through trial by ordeal. But the cost was immediately apparent. Lucian collapsed, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the fight draining away to leave only blood loss and exhaustion. Clara was moving before conscious thought, rushing down from the gallery and across the stage to where he'd fallen. His shoulder wound was worse than it had looked, and she could see silver traces along the blade cut. Thorn had poisoned his weapon, one final violation of the combat rules that no longer mattered because dead men faced no consequences. 3 days passed in a blur of worry and recovery. Vampires could regenerate from almost anything given time, but silver poisoning slowed the process dramatically. Lucian spent those days in and out of consciousness, while his supernatural physiology fought to purge the toxin and repair the damage. Clara stayed at his bedside, reading to him in Morvathian from the children's stories her grandmother had taught her, filling the room with the language he'd fought to preserve. When he finally woke properly, eyes clear and focused, his first question was simple. "Why are you still here?" "Because someone has to make sure you don't do anything stupid," Clara answered, setting aside the book she'd been reading from. "Like fighting ancient vampires in duels to the death. You have a concerning habit of self-sacrifice." Lucian almost smiled, the expression still unfamiliar on features more accustomed to severity. "I won," he pointed out. "Barely counts when you collapse immediately afterward," Clara countered. Very dramatic, but not particularly reassuring. They were finding equilibrium, a partnership built on shared trauma and mutual respect that hadn't yet developed into romance but held the potential. For now, it was enough to sit together and speak in the language that had brought them together, to build something new from ashes and old grief. The world outside had moved on with surprising speed. The media storm died down once human governments issued a statement declaring the matter internal to the vampire community and affirming their respect for Accord's jurisdiction. Apparently, watching Thorn die on live-streamed combat had satisfied the public's bloodlust and desire for resolution. The conspiracy theorists moved on to other obsessions. Normal life reasserted itself with the resilience that characterized human society. Sienna brought reports during her daily visits. Thorn's considerable assets were being divided among purge survivors' families as reparations for crimes committed over 4 decades. Clara was entitled to a substantial share as Thomas Voss's heir, money that could set her up comfortably for life. She donated most of it immediately to fund a Morvathian language preservation project, keeping only enough to live on while she figured out what came next. Dr. Maren Holt published her linguistic analysis in an academic journal that generated unexpected interest. 3 universities reached out within a week wanting to offer Morvathian courses, treating it as a historical language worth studying like Latin or ancient Greek. The tongue was being saved not through hiding, but through exposure, through making people see its value as cultural treasure rather than supernatural threat. "You did what I couldn't," Lucian said when Clara told him about the university interest. "I spent 3 centuries trying to preserve Morvathian through secrecy and protection. You saved it by making them want to remember." "I had help," Clara pointed out. "You nearly died providing that help." Lucian waved off the distinction. "The method matters less than the result." She told him about her plan to teach, to start small with evening classes and grow as interest developed. He offered his library as a resource, thousands of books including texts in Morvathian that hadn't been read in generations. They were building something new from the ashes of what had been lost, a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. The story had begun with Clara shamed at a gala, mocked for an accent that marked her as different, and therefore less. It moved toward conclusion with her invited to speak at a council cultural event, honored rather than hidden, her knowledge recognized as valuable rather than dangerous. The inversion was complete. 6 months later, Clara stood in front of a small classroom in the evening, 10 students arranged in a semicircle facing her. The class was mixed, 5 humans and 5 vampires, all there voluntarily to learn a language that had nearly been erased from existence. She wrote a phrase on the board in careful script, the same words she'd accidentally spoken at the gala that had started this entire chain of events. Kethvara, she said aloud. I am no one. This is what I said when I was afraid, when I'd been taught my entire life that speaking this language made me a target. But the proper greeting is actually Kethmara. I am someone. The difference is small, but essential. The students repeated the phrase, their accents terrible but their effort genuine. The language lived in their mouths, imperfect but real, carrying forward into a generation that would know it as art and history rather than forbidden magic. Lucienne appeared in the doorway partway through the lesson, watching silently with expression that Clara had learned to read as pride. After class, they walked the estate grounds together, the first snow of winter falling in soft flakes that caught in Clara's hair. Do you think it's over? Clara asked, watching her breath mist in the cold air. The fighting and the fear, and the people trying to erase what we're building? Lucian considered the question with his characteristic honesty. No. There are others like Thorn, people who believe the old ways are too dangerous to preserve, or who profit from keeping our kind diminished and controlled. But now we have something worth fighting for, a purpose beyond simple survival. A letter had arrived that afternoon, delivered through channels that suggested the sender knew how to navigate supernatural communication networks. It was postmarked from Eastern Europe with no return address, written entirely in Morvathian script that made Clara's heart race when she translated it. Kethsal Rem, it read. We are the remnant. More Kiva. More survive. There are other speakers, Clara said, holding the letter with trembling hands. Hidden like my grandmother was hidden, waiting to see if it's safe to emerge. People who kept the language alive in secret. Then we find them, Lucian said simply. We bring them together. Build a community of speakers who can teach and learn from each other. The language doesn't have to be a solitary burden anymore. Clara held the letter while Lucien's hand settled on her shoulder. Warm despite the cold, anchoring. Behind them, the lit classroom represented what they'd already built, proof that resurrection was possible. Ahead stretched dark forest and winter night, and whatever challenges would come with revealing themselves to other survivors who had learned caution through trauma. The language didn't die, Clara said softly, speaking the truth into the falling snow. And neither will we. The story could continue from here, finding the remnant and building a new court and facing enemies both old and new. But this chapter ended with hope and purpose, with 2 people who had lost everything finding something worth preserving in the ashes of what had been destroyed. They turned back toward the house together, leaving footprints in fresh snow that would be covered by morning, but which marked their passage in this moment. Proof of survival and the determination to keep moving forward.